We're going to bow for a word of prayer. Travis, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Our Heavenly Father, we're truly grateful this morning to be able to come and to examine your word, Father. We're so grateful for the path that you set before us and the direction that you provide, so that we know we have hope and security. Father, we are grateful for one another, those brothers and sisters who are here, the encouragement that comes from that. We pray that one another, that we can be strong, we can comfort, we can show our care for one another. Father, we pray for our brothers and sisters that worship around this world, Lord. We know some are meeting in places that aren't so blessed as we are, Father, that they have troubles and trials that they must face, straight to their physical harm, Father. We pray for those folks, we pray for their needs, we pray that this day that they would glorify you, and Father, we pray that we can show our diligence all the same, regardless of the trials that come to us. Father, as we get into this lesson, we pray that we would take all things and they would match them up with our lives, and we become better servants of you, Father. Father, we pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Well, 2 weeks ago, we had a missionary here. Last week, Ned had a non-Isaiah lesson. So it's been a while since we've met in this class to study Isaiah. So maybe it's good if we just kind of refresh our minds about what Isaiah is all about. Isaiah prophesied for 40, maybe 50, maybe 60 years during the reigns of 4 kings of Judah. He prophesied concerning things that would happen 7 or so centuries in the future. And as we learned in the New, as we know from the New Testament, there was a guy from Ethiopia that had gone to worship at Jerusalem under the Jewish method of worship, and he was traveling the road, and Philip joined him. And what was he reading? What was that Ethiopian eunuch reading? Isaiah 53. And he says, well, I don't understand what I'm reading here. Was this guy talking about himself, or was he talking about somebody else? So Isaiah is quoted in the New Testament numerous times. He's mentioned numerous times. He talked about the virgin birth of Christ. He chastised those kings that he was contemporary therewith. He was a preacher. He was just an all-around sort of fellow, so to speak. Now, in chapter, we could review a lot of what we've reviewed in the past, but let's just dive into chapter 14 where we left off back in August. Chapter 14 is a discussion with regard to most of the chapters devoted to the fall of the Babylonian Empire. Now this is really strange because not many people, I suppose his contemporaries, had heard of Babylonia. He talks about the Medes. Now the Medes were like 350 miles away. How did Isaiah know all about this stuff? Well, he certainly didn't get it from his human reasoning or his human understanding of world affairs. But of course it was given to him by the God of heaven. This Babylonian, I wonder why, Babylon is mentioned in Revelation, with regard to kind of the epitome of evil. Is that right? The great Babylon. Well, I wonder why it wasn't the great Assyria. That wasn't such a nice nation. Or Egypt. Egypt wasn't such a wholesome, God-fearing nation. Wonder why Babylon.
Well, they were pretty brutal and ruthless.
And the Assyrians were brutal.
Well, maybe they were the worst.
Maybe they were the worst. It might have been that Babylon was the worst. It just might have been that when God looked down on the earth and looked at the nations that came and would come and go, maybe this Babylon was just the worst. Well, here in the 14th chapter of Isaiah talks about the destruction of a nation that at the time that he was prophesying, it wasn't a world power. It was just a spot on the map that had no in the world economy, in the world at large. It was just an ordinary outfit. In the 14th chapter, we'll just read those. We already covered the first 3 verses, but let's just get this in mind. For the Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel. Now, we mentioned, 3 weeks ago that choosing Israel was not choosing the race of people, the Jews. They had already lost, they'd been the chosen group, and they had already lost that status, except for a remnant, and then except for Christ coming through the Jewish lineage of Judah. The Lord will have mercy on Jacob and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. Now, he wasn't talking about bringing them back to, some kind of a world kingdom in the Palestine area. And the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. If God wasn't going to bring them back to that area and make them a world empire, what's he talking about here? Well, he's talking about the kingdom. When the disciples came to Jesus and asked him to teach them to pray, what did he say? He said, "Our Father which art in heaven," and then what else did he say? "Thy kingdom come." They were to pray for the kingdom. Were they praying for some kind of were they supposed to be praying for some kind of an empire, a military establishment, a government on earth? No. A kingdom come. And in verse 2, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of the Lord, that is, the land of the Lord, the kingdom, the Lord's kingdom, for servants and handmaidens, and they shall take them captives, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. Now, when this kingdom was established, and the word of the Lord came forth out of Zion, and Peter preached on the day of Pentecost. He preached primarily to the Jews. He preached to Jews and proselytes. He didn't preach particularly to Gentiles, right? But then when Cornelius was converted, when Peter preached to Cornelius, and the Gentiles started coming into the church, and when the church spread primarily through the efforts of the Apostle Paul throughout the known world, the dominant group of people were probably Gentiles, right? Now that's different than the Jewish system, the Old Testament Jewish system, right? Quite different. Under the old regime, the Gentiles were enemies, right? The Gentiles were, anathema to the Jews. Jews didn't want anything to do with them. But now, it's kind of the other way around now. Well, first of all, the Jews and the Gentiles are all one in Christ, right? Paul said. The Jews now made up probably at the end of the first century, probably made up a minority of the church. And those people that used to be enemies of the Jews, what was their status? Well, they were brethren. And it's kind of like now the Gentiles were kind of, well, they were more prominent in the church than the Jews. And so it's kind of a reversal here. And it shall come to pass in verse 3, in the day that the Lord shall give thee rest from thy sorrow and from thy fear and from the hard bondage wherein thou was made to serve. Now, there he's probably talking a little more about the contemporary situation. And then here's what's going to happen to Babylon. In verse 4, that thou shalt take up this proverb, this saying, this oracle against the king of Babylon, and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased. Now, when he's talking about the king of Babylon here, he may have been referring to Belshazzar, the last king of the Babylonian Empire, the king who had this drunken feast and had his minions and his concubines and wives drinking from the cups that had been confiscated from the temple 70 years earlier. He might have been talking about that specific king. What else might he have been talking about? All the kings of Babylon? Or all the evil kings for, just kind of the king of Babylon being the poster child, the symbol of all of the kings who had, in the past, had opposed God, because these kings typically opposed God. And how do we know they opposed God? And in what form? In what way did they oppose God?
They did evil in His sight.
And they elevated themselves how high on the totem pole?
Considered themselves as God.
Pardon me?
Considered themselves to be God.
Yeah. They wanted to be referred to as the highest. They were the highest being in the universe in their minds. And that reminds us of a New Testament character, a Caesar of the New Testament times. He expected folks to do what to him? To worship him. It's kind of not unlike when Herod Agrippa went down from Jerusalem to Caesarea and gave a big speech to the folks there. He was all decked out in royal regalia, and the sun was no doubt shining on him, and he was sparkling, and so what did the people in the audience do? Yeah. And he liked it, right? Until the worms came to him, right? Remember that scene? Where he was infested with worms and died? Maggots there on the spot. So these folks had the idea that they were the highest being in the universe and expected homage being paid to them, worship being paid to them. And in verse 4 there again, how hath the oppressor ceased? Now, he's talking about how this is going to unfold. This city, this nation, this empire, that was the golden city. Why golden city? Pardon me? Well, gold seems to be kind of the, if you picked out one emblem of wealth, what would it probably be? Gold. So, they were, it was just a tremendous wealthy city at the expense of other nations and the peoples of the earth. And he said, Isaiah prophesied this city would be ceased, ended. And as history plays out, that particular territory is nothing but it's an uninhabitable area today. That very territory is uninhabitable. And over time, it just fizzled out to nothing. And the Lord, in verse 5, and the Lord has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. That idea of the scepter of the rulers, broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. What's the scepter? I mean, what is it about the scepter?
Show power or authority.
Yeah. Now think of the power they had when Esther came before the king. Was it Ahasuerus? Yeah. And even anybody that approached the king without being invited, what might happen to them? That's how much power these dudes had. And in that case, apparently he raised the scepter in a fashion that says, come on in. It could have been your head taken off, But, verse 6, he who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruleth the nation in anger is persecuted and none hindereth. Now you got to wonder when, and we've alluded to this several times, but it bears repeating. When Daniel was before Belshazzar, and that hand, then they had seen that hand writing on the wall. Remember that scene? I wonder what was going through this powerful king's mind at that point. Well, we know that he was pretty shook up because what did he do? He called the wise men. And then finally got to Daniel. And Daniel said, in our vernacular, hey dude, you've been weighed in the balances and you're found wanting. What was he saying? You're finished. You're done, man. You're done. Well, God said he smote the people in wrath, and he said of this people, of this person, this king who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruleth the nations is in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. There's nobody coming to his rescue. Egypt's not coming to the rescue. There's no nation coming to his rescue. Now, this despot ruler, what does Isaiah say is going to be the reaction of the folks around about? Are all the nations going to sympathize with this dude? Are all the people going to sympathize and say and give him a royal, burial and that sort of thing? In our history, a Reagan type burial. Remember that big deal they had when Reagan was buried when he was in his funeral. Too much pomp there, in my opinion. But that's what happened. The whole earth, the reaction is the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. And they break forth into singing. Now that was, the God said that's going to be the attitude, the disposition, the demeanor of the folks. In fact, metaphorically here in verse 8, yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Now, that's quite a metaphor, isn't it? And even the trees are going to be happy. Metaphorically, they're going to be happy. Everybody's going to be happy about the demise of Babylon, according to this. Now, hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. Now, some of the translations there talk about Sheol, right? Sheol? Any translation you have? What translation you have? Okay. So, hell, Sheol, the grave. What's he talking about here? He's talking, well, here are some things he could be talking about. Just the grave, right? The Hadean world, the departed spirits world. What else could he be talking about? Okay. He could be talking about the great pit. Well, we got to figure out what he's talking about here. Hell from beneath is moved for thee, or Sheol, the grave, to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. And they shall speak and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy vials. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. Now, that kind of talks about, when they talk about the worms and maggots and so forth, that seems to be talking about the grave, doesn't it? Huh? But this idea that there's a kind of a welcoming committee, kind of a, I mean, how would, if that's merely the grave, how would that be? I mean, dead people don't speak, right?
I think in a similar fashion, it's been like saying Sodom and Gomorrah will rise up and judge from the edge. It's just saying, effectively, in this particular context, despite how great you thought you were then, just like everybody else, you were too. You come to the grave, and you didn't escape it. No one does.
And so, there are a couple schools of thought on this. One is what you've expressed here, and then there's the other school of thought that the people in the unseen world, the Hadean world, were speaking or responding to his kind of making light of, you were such a big man on campus when you were, ruling over all the world, and now you're just nothing here. Or it could have been, the idea of the, metaphorically, the dead welcoming him. So, I don't know. There are at least two schools of thought on this. I don't know. Somebody inform me. I don't know which it is. Whether it's the people in the Hadean world welcoming him, or making fun of him, or whether it's Travis, what you said. So I don't know. Herschel, straighten us out on this.
Sounds to me like hell is just happy to get more souls.
Pardon me?
It sounds to me like hell is just happy to get more souls. Seems like a whole plan. Get as many as they can.
Yeah. Oh, that's for sure. But really, what's the takeaway of all this for us? What's the takeaway? Well, that's yeah. What's the message here to the atheist? What does the atheist believe? The atheist believes that humankind is the highest form, right? No God, no God. So what's the takeaway for the atheist? What's the takeaway for the arrogant?
Reality will set in, just like
Yeah.
he thought he was the God, and reality will set in when he'll realize it's too late that there is a God.
What's the takeaway for a guy that has a button in Moscow that could trigger a nuclear war, or in Washington, D.C.? What's the takeaway for that? What's the takeaway for the rich and the powerful?
All have the same faith.
Yeah. So I think that's the message here. For us, that's kind of the message.
I wonder if some of those kings, though, that are referred to there, is who he destroyed. Where he took their kingdoms, or now he's at the same level.
Well, and here's this, the king of Babylon. You know, one minute he's in charge of the world, so he thinks. And the next minute he's zero.
So in other words, God has judgment over everyone, rich, poor.
Yeah, that's another takeaway. I mean, it's everybody's on the same. Reality is everybody's on the same plane, regardless of what they think about in this life, right? Everyone is going to stand at the judgment bar of God, right? King, peasant, rich, poor, whatever. Now, this Babylon was particularly, I suppose the king of Babylon was saying, there's no way, or thinking there's no way that our power is going to cease. And we've had people like that throughout history, right? The folks that are associated with Hitler and Germany, they had a notion that their regime would last for how many years? Huh? And they figured that what they were establishing would last for how many centuries? At least 10 centuries. Now think about that. Think about, so where is that that world dominated, or the idea of dominating the world for 10 centuries? Zero, right? With regard to the king of Babylon, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? That Lucifer designation there, other translations use the terminology day star. What else?
That son of the morning is a day star, and Lucifer term is howl. It's saying, basically, howl morning star. Why is the morning star? Because that's the thing that's bright out the sky. So it's the prominent one, okay? So howl, prominent one, over your thing.
Yeah, so some folks have the idea that we're talking about the devil here, Satan. But most likely it's just a reference to, the king of Babylon, or, him being a poster child for kings. People that are, in the mind of the world, they're luminaries, but they're not only their gloss, their shine, their luminaries. Those folks are cut down. How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken nations? The same person that has all that authority and luster and eminence is cut down to zero. Verse 13, for thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. Now, when the prophet says, I will exalt my throne above the stars of heaven, I mean, what is he saying? What was their attitude? Well, this is the idea that they were the highest power. They were God on earth. Yeah, and for some reason, God, with regard to Nebuchadnezzar, for some reason, God gave him an opportunity to understand that he wasn't God, right? I mean, for 7 years, he was out pawing around like a wild bull, right? Just living in purely the animal kingdom, until he understood what? There's a God in heaven, the God that Daniel worshipped. Now you wonder why. Well, why would God, give this work with this king and get him to understand that? And he must have understood it because he must have understood that there's God in heaven, because what did he declare as far as what did he rule as far as what people should be worshiping? I mean, it became a state religion, right? It became, you worship the God of heaven, the Hebrew God, Daniel's God. Well, he's in verse 14, I will send above the heights of the clouds, and I will be like the Most High. Well, they considered themselves God. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, in verse 15, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee, and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble and did shake the kingdoms? I mean, when he was in the coffin, so to speak, is this the guy that shook up the world? There was the King of the nations that made the world, in verse 17, as a wilderness. Is this the guy that destroyed the land, the landscape of other nations, destroyed people? Is this the guy that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof? That opened not the house of his prisoners, that took, prisoners, that incarcerated folks? But thou art cast out of thy scepter, grave, like an abominable branch, and as the raiment of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, and go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. Now that would be as a carcass trodden underfoot. Through the ages, respectable people have not abused corpses, right? Through the ages. I mean, respectable people. There's a law against abusing a corpse, right? In our land. Well, that law is based on, I suppose, in a sense, a Judeo-Christian ethic. But it's just kind of common law, isn't it? What was it, in Korea, or Vietnam or one of those wars that weren't supposed to be wars or whatever. They used human corpses as ways as bridges to get across swampy areas. Now, how despicable is that? Well, that's it's this king's carcass, so to speak, was trodden under feet. That.
Could this also mean kind of give the rulers of today kind of like a warning that if they lead their people the wrong way, and cause the wars and everything, that they're not going to have particular judgment for them?
Yeah, if they paid attention to it, if they listened to it, yeah, wouldn't that be a warning? That's a warning to anybody. That's a warning to anybody that thinks of himself too highly, or assumes or takes a position that humankind is on par with God, or there is no God. I mean, it's all the same. They're all in the same batch. Verse 20, thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land. Now, for those Old Testament kings, burial was a big deal, wasn't it? How do we know burial was a big deal in Egypt? Huh? Yeah, what landmarks do we have that? Pyramids. And enormous underground caverns hewed out in rocks. Where is it in Egypt? In what part of Egypt? Valley of the Kings, yeah. There's another name for that, David, and I've forgotten it. The what? Okay. Well, anyway, that was a big deal among the rulers of the ancient kingdoms. Thou shalt not be joined with them in burial, because thou hast destroyed thy land and slain thy people. The seeds of evildoers shall never be honored. And continuing here of this prophecy of the destruction of Babylon, prepare slaughter for his children for the iniquity of their father, that they do not rise nor possess the land nor fill the face of the world with cities. The children of these people are going to suffer because of the deeds of the king of Babylon, the children. Now, how does that square with the idea that that children are not going to bear the sins of their fathers?
We're not speaking in spiritual sense here. They were given the consequences of their fathers, the Amorites, any other great nation that's gone on.
You have to separate consequences from the spiritual aspect of it. The door's opened. I don't hear the bell. I guess it's time to start next week.